I'm Brice Venu, UB's Vice President and Chief Information Officer. I'll be sitting down with students, faculty, staff, and other thought leaders outside of UB to highlight some important technology topics that affect campus community members like you. Let's take a ride in one of our electric Tech Squad cars and meet our guest today. Our guest today is UB's Vice President for Research and Economic Development. Dr. Venu Govindaraju has been globally recognized for his groundbreaking research and is a pioneer in artificial intelligence. Now, he's leading the AI Institute for Exceptional Education to use artificial intelligence to help change the lives of children for the better. Well, Venu, welcome to the show. We're looking forward to the conversation. I want to share right off the bat our poll results. We ask, do you think AI tools such as ChatGPT will have a major impact on higher education? Well, overwhelmingly, 100% of you said yes. So, love to get your thoughts on that as we get started.
No surprise there at all, Brice, and thank you for having me over here. We could have predicted that answer even before the survey because it's all pervading.
Can you tell us your story? How did you come to the University of Buffalo?
So, we have to go back about 40 years. So I think in the early 80s is when computer science and engineering, computer science as a discipline was mature enough, at least in India, where I come from, to be offered as a discipline or a department of study in itself in the undergraduate program. So I went to one of the oldest and the elitist of the IITs, which is my alma mater, IIT Kharagpur. And, I had the opportunity to study computer science. And so at that time, we didn't know much. The field was just growing. And, the trend was in those days to, go for higher education. And myself, along with many of my classmates, we looked at the United States as the place to be for higher ed. And, these were the days where internet was not available, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we couldn't look up universities on the web. So what did we have to go with? So we were looking at brochures that were mailed by universities, and the glossier the pictures on the brochure, the more attractive that university was. And of course, Niagara Falls has always been an attraction. So UB actually offered me a very generous presidential fellowship, which was the deciding factor for me, to come to UB. And I've been here since, and it has been a great journey.
Not only did you come here for your graduate degrees and your PhD, but you've actually spent most of your entire career here. And I'd like to put your career in numbers for the audience, right? So you hold 6 patents, you have authored 7 books, 86 journal articles, you've written 29 book chapters, and you've given 350 symposium and conference papers. So walk us through your incredible career here at the university. What changes, what you have seen at this university over the 40 years?
Thank you for going over those numbers. As you and I know, it's the quality that matters, and I assure you those are of high quality.
I'm sure.
When I came here, the topic of my research was computer vision. And the idea was, and this will be interesting to your audience, Rochester, which is our neighboring town in Western New York, had 2 big tech giants, Xerox and Kodak. And Kodak was all about film, right? You would have your SLR cameras, you would put your film, and then, everybody was taking pictures. And that was a big business. And Kodak came to us at UB, as part of an industry partnership. And the project given was, when you take a picture, can you automatically tell where the human faces are? Think about it. Today, any app you go to, they automatically box the people's faces.
They do.
But in those days, that would have been a great novelty. And that was my PhD topic. I worked on that and actually delivered code to Kodak. Unfortunately, the whole film business went in a different direction. And but that's where my thesis was. And in the early 90s, when I was graduating, it was not easy to find a university professor position, an academic position, especially for international students who were studying here. And it is just by chance, that I was offered a postdoc position on a different project, which was funded by the Postal Service. And that's how I stayed back and kind of shifted my area of, research a little bit. And that led to, 3 decades of career at UB.
The topic about artificial intelligence is certainly a hot topic today, and even at the individual personal level with things like ChatGPT, which is available at this point for everyone. But given the things that you've talked about, you are a pioneer in AI research. There's no doubt about it. So, can you talk about that one that you've just mentioned, the work with the Postal Service and handwriting recognition? Talk a little bit about that. It's very fascinating.
So in those days, artificial intelligence was, as a discipline, was still looking at toy problems. It was not. That was the criticism, about AI, and which was also called the winter of AI, artificial intelligence, that it was not dealing with real world problems. So while, my research in the postal domain and postal automation was all about pattern recognition, which is now central to artificial intelligence, people shied away from calling it AI in those days. They would say vision, pattern recognition, and so on. And so the history of UB's success and pioneering effort in postal automation goes back to the time where, the machine OCR technology, the state of the art was such that it could read all machine printed addresses, okay, with some errors, but it could handle machine printed addresses. It would actually not be able to read a single, not 1% of the handwritten address.
Which were most addresses at the time, right?
I wouldn't say most, but a significant portion.
Sure.
I would say 10 to 15%. But given the volume of mail in the US, I don't know the real numbers today, but in those days, it was 500 million pieces a day.
Wow.
So 10 to 15% can be 50, 60 million pieces. And so automating that, to any degree is going to lead to many savings. And so our journey was, and I was leading as a project manager at UB with a lab of several postdocs and students. And we were told by the Postal Service, to see if we can do something, because the industry, was not focusing on it. And as you know, in many of these things, if the industry doesn't believe it can crack it and it can make money on it, it's probably not going to address it. So what we did was, we were all, young and, with energy, and we had bright ideas and had a great group. And we actually took from 0% to about 14% in its first installation.
That's impressive.
And that led to more than $100 million of savings for the Postal Service in one holiday season. See, holiday season is when people tend to write cards, and it's handwritten, and so that made believers out of the industry. And I think that was our biggest contribution. And this is considered now, looking back, as a major success story in artificial intelligence, that we were able to do that kind of automation. Today, if you go and check, the recognition rate is some 96, 97%, and there is perhaps no difference between machine printed or handwritten addresses. So your handwriting for the AI algorithm is just as easy as a nicely typed address.
Wow, it's very impressive. And I have to say, when I interviewed at the university now 10 years ago, one of the claims that I've received was the research you had done with the Postal Service. So congratulations. It's a great accomplishment for you and your team, as well as the university. So carry that forward now. We'll come to today, because you've carried that type of research for 30 or 40 years. So now we find ourselves, in things you're doing with your team around AI for good, which is in this wonderful AI Institute for Exceptional Education. This is coming at this point through, initially, I'll say, a pretty large 5-year grant from the NSF. And this AI Institute for Exceptional Education, we understand, will focus on what's 3 or 4 million children who have speech and language service needs, right? So can you tell us about this as we've now carried from the Postal Service to today and the research that has brought us to this? Tell us about this exciting new program.
So we are all very excited about this new project, which we have won. UB is in the lead. It's $20 million for a group of universities. We are 30 researchers across 9 institutions with UB at the lead. And this is for a 5-year period. And the objective is to essentially, I will put it in 2 different categories. One is it's all about scalability. So today, if you look at speech language pathologists who can help our children, at the young age, 4, 5, 8 years old, when it is best to address any speech language disabilities that they have to have maximum impact. So how can we identify them? So where it becomes a scaling problem because the pathologists that we have are about 60,000 in the US, and the children who need to be identified having these special needs is about 3 to 4 million. So that's the scaling problem, right? So if you can bring in artificial intelligence tools, then you can screen better, you can make sure that no child is left behind, if you will.
Yes.
And the other category I'll put it in terms of impact is in equity. Because even while we have shortage of speech language pathologists, you can imagine that the need is going to be even more acute in rural areas, in certain areas, which is poor school districts.
Sure.
So those who actually need more help are being left behind. So we are going to address both the scalability and the equity issue, develop artificial intelligence tools to automatically screen, and then also have automatic intervention, which we call the AI orchestrator, where it will be customized because different children have different kinds of needs. They can't be all grouped together as speech. There will be many nuances, and can we have AI tools which might be in a classroom embodied as a robot, where the kids are interacting one-on-one or in a group, or the robot is just watching from the side, digesting everything, and then coming up with a plan for each of those children, as to what exactly is their difficulty, where do they need the support, and that will all be provided to the parents and the pathologists, to help. So we believe this is such a nice social good, feel good kind of AI, in today's discourse where there's so much apprehension about what AI can and cannot do and what it should not do. This for sure is something that we must do.
I can see this same technology perhaps applying to other personality traits or other disorders.
Absolutely.
Imagine, right?
I was just at a conference in India, which is being organized by the G20 United Nations, and there are actually 13 different kinds of disabilities. Of course, you have deafness and blindness, and there are so many other kinds of learning disabilities too. But we take one step at a time. We have to be focused. This particular project is about speech and language, but we are open to addressing other kinds of disabilities as well. And we are trying to see, and this is going to be also a partnership of our researchers, postdoc scientists, with the community, with the school districts, with the parents. There are many stakeholders over here. And we're going to bring all of them together, and absolutely, we're going to take it to other disabilities as well.
That's awesome. And as you've talked about the journey of AI, and you've definitely got to the AI for good as you're outlining, and I think our audience will love to follow the progress that you make and your team makes in this wonderful place that you're working. So this is a good example of AI for good. So how do you feel that we can, in other ways, apply AI in a good way that will help mankind or the world?
It can make an impact, for example, in health. I think it's already making a big impact in health. I can see, just like we talked about screening children, we can have universal screening for our own health, where we don't need so many doctor's visits, or we get early warnings and so on. And this can all be done with a human-centric interface. And so I see there are so many opportunities in every field of life where AI is going to have a positive role.
It does sound that way, and you can just imagine as you're outlining the good things that AI can do. But of course, there's a other side of that, right? And we're hearing about things, in the news and others about the cons. Where do you see the negative side? And then, of course, what can we do to try to minimize that?
I actually welcome this discussion on what are the negative things that are possible, because safeguards have to be put in place. Now, the biggest one for me, the biggest con of AI has been, the disinformation that we see all around us. In the media, you really don't know what to believe and not believe. I recall about 15 years back, the whole idea was you go to a website for service, and the website service behind the scenes had to decide whether it was a human being or a robot that was interacting. And we did some work on, how do you tell between a robot or a chatbot or something and a human being? Yeah. And this also goes back to the foundations of computer science and the Turing test. So disinformation to me today, how do I believe whether it is written or generated by a human being, and whether it's true? Because if it's generated by a machine, it can be made to look like having been generated by a human, and there can be so much falsehood that can spread. And we saw that as undermining our democracy, actually, in the last several years. So I think at UB, we have been actually taking this head on. Yeah. We started a center on information integrity. Right. And the nice thing about this center, and I think this is a point I would like to make, is today AI is not only about computer science. It is taking in all disciplines. So our Information Integrity Center actually brings computer scientists and humanists and folks in communication and social sciences come together, to see how to combat this challenge of false information on the web. So computer science is going to be like mathematics, I think, soon, where no matter which field you go in, you need those as your tools.
Interesting. And that really is a great segue into the next question, which is, it's a phenomenal opportunity. So where do you see all this playing out, let's say for UB and for our education that we provide? So now think back to you as a young graduate student in the early 80s. Now project a mid 2020 student showing up at UB. Where will this all go in education?
This is going to influence every aspect of our lives, not just education. And I think this is the time for us to put in the safeguards, So today when we build like a new house, there is code, you need to follow the code. And that's for our own safety. They talk about fire exits and, which rooms can be where and what can be done and not done. And most of the people comply, and so we are safer that way. Mm-hmm. I think the same thing has to be done with all these artificial intelligence algorithms. There has to be a code that safeguards us so that when the developers are developing and with the tools, even the automated development, they are all following certain rules so that you and I are safe. And this is, being responsible. So with the students coming in today, I see them as they will embrace, new technology. I remember, going back to my own field of document analysis and recognition, let's go 3 decades back, they used to talk about paperless office. Then there would be a counter argument which said, what? Human beings like to hold paper. They don't want to hold electronics, silicon kind of a pad. They like to turn the pages. They like to smell the paper. So there is and they said, so newspapers will never go away. Lo and behold, today most of us are consuming our news on the media. Right. So, and then as the newer generations are more used to this technology, the more it's going to spread. So I feel, since we are at this inflection point of, how are the students going to take AI tools, I think they're going to embrace it. I think society, is going to rise in making sure that the good of AI always keeps winning, because it's always a race. The good guys and the bad guys. You know that very well in the cybersecurity area. Yes. Some of the smartest guys are
even
sitting on the other side.
In cybersecurity, right? For
Absolutely.
Yes. Right.
So I think this race, is going to go on as long as humanity is there. But I think when you talk about education, I think our students will learn to use these tools in a responsible way, and it's going to pervade every aspect of education.
It's good to know what you're doing, Venu, and it's good to hear your active role in this, because as you talk about the ethical use, I think it's great that you'll be engaged, and UB will be engaged in helping that conversation. It's early days in some of the ethical behavior, so it's good to hear. I just have one final question, and it's really about looking out into the future. What does our life with AI look like? In 10 or 20 years, you and I retire, and what does it look like in those, as you can think? Because you would probably have one of the best perspectives on that of anyone.
Yes, but you and I both know that it will be different from whatever you and I can imagine today.
This is true.
Right? Because it's going to go in ways which will, what 30 years back, 40 years back, you and I thought was science fiction seems to be reality today. So I am
still don't
hopeful.
have the flying car yet, but other than that, go ahead.
But who knows, right?
Maybe, yes.
But you know what? I think we have drones now. Okay,
well, that's true. This is true.
But I would say that the future, as long as we follow the safeguards and do what is responsible, the ethics are there. We teach in our universities, in our classes, how to do things ethically. I'm sure the technology is going to have more benefits that will far outweigh any of these cons. It's so much efficiency. We talked about our AI institute. What a speech language pathologist could do, does today in a week, with our tools, maybe can do in an hour. And can you imagine how much more time they can spend with children and so on? So I see a future where you and I will have more time for the nicer things in life, because the machines will get efficient. So you and I can go walk in the garden and smell the roses and
I like that.
Breathe the fresh air.
Are those real roses or is that artificial? Oh, that's okay.
Hopefully it will be all real. But I think the future is bright.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, Venu, thank you for taking time with us. It's so interesting to talk to you, and look forward to following the research that you're doing in the University of Buffalo. So
thank you.
Great to have the conversation.
To be here.
Thanks a lot.
You.
Now, head over to the UBIT Twitter page to vote in our latest poll. Our question for you today is, does social media have an overall positive or negative influence on today's students? We can't wait to hear from you, and we'll share the results in our next episode. Do you have a question for me when it comes to technology at UB? Here's your chance to ask. Submit your questions to cio@buffalo.edu, and we'll answer some in the next episode. Thanks for watching this episode of Tech Talk. Check out our other episodes online anytime at buffalo.edu/UBIT/Tech Talk.